So if we go back to some of the more controversial aspects of XP, you mentioned already the idea of incremental design and evolutionary design. So the whole idea here is that the design kind of appears by magic as you write code, right? That's the whole idea. And then there are a lot of questions around that, like, can you get stuck? Can you get into a point where, if you go step by step, little by little, you get into a point where you have no idea where to go anymore? And is that longer than trying to figure out where to go from the first place?
Right. So yes, that can happen. And again, this is where we have to think of the difference between practicing test-driven development. I'll just use TDD because it's easier to say. Practicing TDD as a learning technique and practicing TDD after you have become sufficiently proficient, let's say. So the first group of people will, of course, fall into, will find themselves in a local maximum, and everywhere they look, they can only go down instead of further up. That happened to me, that happened to you, that happens to everyone. It's more likely to happen when you're learning because, or I should say, that's going to happen to everyone. The difference is how you behave when you get there. And the people who are still learning, when they get there, panic a little bit. You and I get there and go, aha, yeah, I can kind of see what happened. It looks like getting to the next higher part of the mountain range is going to require a little bit of going back, of taking some steps back before we go forward again. Should I refactor there, or should I throw this away and build this small part again? And that's part of what having experience does, is it allows you in that moment to not panic, but to kind of go, aha, yeah, this is one of those times. Okay, it's a little bit annoying, but I guess we're going to have to take a few steps backward before we can go forward again. Or, oh, this ended up being not quite what I expected. That's okay. I'll just throw away the last 2 days and try again. So for the people who are practicing TDD and learning, they might panic, and then they might, pull the ripcord, have the parachute open, and say, okay, I never want to do that again. And those of us who got past that will feel more comfortable just sort of having that knowing smile, nodding a little bit and saying, okay, yeah, oops, it happened again. No problem. I know how to recover from this. And so now the question becomes, and isn't that slower than sitting on your hands and figuring it all out up front and then just doing it right the first time? And my answer to that is maybe. All I know is that when I used to sit on my hands and think for months and then do it right the first time, I never did it right the first time. And that might just have been me. What I do know is that, so it's when people used to ask about, well, isn't all this testing wasteful? Ron Jeffries was the first one I heard say, if I knew which mistakes I was going to make, the test would be wasteful, and I would be sitting on a beach right now. I wouldn't be in this message group writing to you. And that's part of the answer, right? Is that we don't know what mistakes we're going to make. So because we don't know what mistakes we're going to make, it seems to me wise to invest in the skill of recovering from mistakes sooner, recognizing them sooner so that you maybe avoid falling in the hole as you step your foot down into the hole. You recognize it as a hole and you stop, or in knowing how to get out of the hole once you fall in. I don't think you ever need to get to the point where you see the hole coming from 20 meters away and walk around it. I think most people have the picture in their head that that's the skill they need to develop. And we who think about responding to feedback recognize that if you have good recovery mechanisms, and if you have good and low-cost recovery mechanisms, then you don't have to put all your money into mitigation and detection strategies. Now, again, go back to the discussion we had earlier about how the design pattern and the XP community came together. I said that I saw the XP community as sort of figuring out what is the least from the design patterns, plop, architecture community we need and still do great work. And so we have to reject them for a while to figure out where the edge of the cliff is to find out how much of that stuff we actually need. I think the same is true here. People have this idea that in order to manage risk, they have to drive down the probability of failure. There's another term in that product, which is the cost of failure. If you drive the cost of failure down, the probability of failure can go up and your overall risk still goes down. So wouldn't it be good to be, wouldn't the best case, so first thing, if we focus on driving down the cost of failure, which is easier, our results will still get better. If after that we know both how to reduce the probability of failure and how to reduce the cost of failure, now we win the game. And people who are stuck in the mindset of just reducing the probability of failure, of trying to avoid the holes, never learn how to recover from failure. And failure will happen at the least opportune time, and they won't be able to recover. We might fail more often, but every time we fail, it costs less. And when failure happens at a bad moment, it doesn't destroy the department. It just delays the launch by a couple of days. We'll recover, it's fine. Or we end up having to rip some code out and write it again. And it's true. You and I could sit down now and write some code together. And we can do a lot of the test driving in our heads. We can just talk to each other in tests to clarify what we understand. And we might only need to type 20% of those tests into the computer. But we both know that as soon as something goes wrong, and as soon as 3 minutes goes by before we understand the mistake we made, we agree that the next thing we're going to do is write some tests. That is not a mindset you can develop, or a habit. I don't like mindset. That's not a habit you can develop if you didn't spend a few years just practicing writing the tests first. That to me is the real power in doing that. And so when you look at us, we look like we're going slower, but we get done sooner. And when we make mistakes, it doesn't derail us nearly as much. And this, again, goes back to the difference between cost accounting and throughput accounting. I can sit here and tell random person X that the cost of failure dominates the cost of a project. That making mistakes is the bottleneck in a project. And it seems like they either believe it or they don't. And they don't believe it until they experience it for themselves. But they don't experience it for themselves until they try to do better. And I don't know how to convince them to try to do better for the first time until they reach a crisis point where they have nothing left to lose, and I'm there at the moment that happens. Which, ironically, was, if you go back and read Ward's Wiki, in the discussions around how do we get people to try XP, how do we lure them into our community for the first time, either wait for them to hit a crisis or engineer a crisis are still the best strategies we've ever had. But trying to convince them doesn't work. It doesn't work often enough. That being there as the supportive shoulder for them to cry on when it blows up in their face, and then feeding them a couple of XP cookies and getting them hooked, that I still have not found a strategy more effective than that. And I'm not sure what that says about us as a species. I think that's just, and having read books like Influence and other of these sort of how does the human mind work, what are the bugs in the human brain, have led me to believe that we probably will never be able to do much better than that. So you might as well embrace it.
So if we go back to TDD, this whole thing of writing tests, it seems like a lot of extra work.
Yes,
so
it does seem like that.
I can get my task, I can write the code and then pass it out to the testers and they'll figure it out. And if I'm lucky enough, somebody else will get the bugs and not me.
Yes.
Back. So then should I invest into, working? It's a lot of learning, it's a lot of practicing. It seems like a lot of work to get there. What do I get out of it?
Well, so the first thing I'll remind you is the story that we started with, right? The two important things to take from that story are I reached a point where I had nothing left to lose. And maybe a better way to say it is the pain of continuing to do what I was doing was worse than the pain of doing something else. I reached the point where after months of awareness, I realized that continuing to just type code in a trance into the computer was not making the finish line, was not helping me approach the finish line any sooner. So for the programmers out there who have not yet reached that point, don't bother with TDD. Keep going. Do what you want to do. It's fine. It's working. You're still getting paid. Everyone's happy. The second part about that story is all I did was write tests first. I didn't know how to refactor. I didn't know any of that stuff. I hadn't read the refactoring book yet. I didn't know any of the cool, test doubles tricks. I didn't understand the power of the dependency inversion principle. I didn't understand the power of immutable data. I didn't know any of these things. I was just a poor Java programmer with 1.5 years experience who had been raised writing code in BASIC and Pascal with a little bit of C. The most sophisticated design principle I understood was don't have too many global variables. And yet, I did in 9 days what I couldn't do previously in 3 months. So for me, the key point here is, and yes, second system syndrome has something to do with that, but the key point here is I wasn't very good at what I was doing. And still, because test first programming helped me notice the hole the moment I stepped in it and get out of it right away, taking the cost of failure from here to here was what I'm convinced that's what allowed me to finish in 9 days. And well, I shouldn't say it that way. That was a huge ingredient in being able to finish in 9 days. Certainly living with the problem for 3 months and trying to solve it helped me. But I wasn't very good at what I was doing, and already it made a big difference. It's also important to understand that in that situation, I had almost total autonomy over the design of my part of the system. So if you're working in a factory with a 1973 style Iron Fist architect who made all the important decisions and is just telling you to put this code in this bucket, this code in this bucket, this code in this bucket, it might not help you that much. Agreed. But I didn't really know what I was doing, and it still helped me a lot. I didn't really have the confidence to try it until I reached the point where I had to admit that doing it the old way wasn't working anymore. If you don't have those two ingredients, then no, run away from, don't change anything. As long as you keep getting your pay in your bank account, as you know, it's the old joke. As long as you're still outrunning your fat friend, you don't have to outrun the bear. As long as you are producing better results than the bottom 20% of the programmers around you in your company, in your team, in your department, there's no reason for you to change anything. But when you are ready to change because you are sick and tired of making a mistake, or fixing a mistake and creating 2 more mistakes, fixing 2 mistakes and creating another mistake, when you're tired of arguing with testers about whether this is a bug or not, when you're tired with arguing with testers about how to reproduce a bug, when you're tired of being asked to fix bugs in code that you wrote 4 months before, 6 months before, 8 months before, then test first programming and eventually test-driven development is probably a good place for you to try next. It's probably a good thing for you to try. It will solve a handful of your problems. And if you're not sure, then go find somebody who has a little bit of gray in their beard or hair who and describe your situation to them and describe the symptoms you're feeling. What are you noticing about how you're working that isn't beneficial for you? And ask them whether evolutionary design is right for you. It might be. Certainly if you reach the point where you have no idea what to do next, you just know that you can't keep living this way, then trying TDD on the weekends is probably not going to be a wasteful investment. But there's only one way to find out. At that point, you use the casino technique, right? You figure out how much time you can afford to lose. You spend that much time practicing. Find yourself a community of people who can be a shoulder for you to cry on, who can give you advice when you need it, who can answer your questions, and just try it. But I've long got past the point of wandering the countryside trying to convince people to try TD. I did that early in my career because I thought that was a way to make money and because I was insecure about my own feelings. And so by pushing people to think the way I was validating my own opinions through them. Once I got past all that and I became more financially secure and I became just more emotionally secure in the way I worked, then it was much easier to adopt this attitude of, here are some ways for you to decide whether this might be helpful for you, and I'm ready to help you when you are ready to try. And it's one of the reasons why, when Yahoo decided to retire web access to the Yahoo groups, I wanted to make sure that the 15 years of almost 20 years of collected wisdom from the extreme programming group and the test-driven development group didn't disappear. So I rescued them. And so now you can go to groups.io and search for extreme programming or test-driven development and find many of the old XP folks and some of the new XP folks and some of the new Scrum folks and some of the new Kanban folks having these discussions again. So that if you do want to try evolutionary design, test-first programming, test-driven development, and you don't like going to Stack Overflow to ask questions, or you don't think you're getting good answers from Quora, this is another place for you to ask. And I'll say to anyone watching there the same thing I say to everyone. We feed on your questions. Your questions become our marketing material. It's literally how we find new clients, because we can't look like experts if we don't have things to be smart about. And every time you ask us a question, either you make us think about something we never thought about before, or you remind us about something that we stopped thinking about 12 years ago, and we don't even notice the water we're swimming in anymore. But not everybody is there. So when somebody asks me the question, well, isn't pair programming just paying twice as much for the same results? I settled that question in my mind in 2003. I stopped thinking about that. It's when somebody asks me, then I have to dust off my answer and give it to them again. And every time I do that, I have to think about it again and wonder, has anything really big changed here? No, not really. I can kind of give them the same answer. It's not just how we market ourselves. It's not just how we advertise that we're experts, but it's also, it helps us avoid becoming the kind of thought leader that most people don't like. The kind of stodgy, I haven't had to think about this anymore in 15 years, therefore I haven't. Therefore my answers never change and I never evolve. We wouldn't have modern Agile if people didn't continue to push, if we didn't still experience dissatisfaction with how we were working. And so, should you do test-driven development? Maybe. And not just in the I don't know who you are, but also in the you might be in a situation where doing test-driven development would be beneficial, but investing in learning test-driven development would be too costly for you right now. That's the thing that I can kind of help you figure out. That's part of what I do in my coaching, is I help people figure out when should they try to do these things. Which XP, Scrum, Kanban practices could be helpful? How do they know that they should do them now? And if they shouldn't do them now, how will they recognize 6 months from now, a year from now, that they should start? That's part of what I can do as having 20 years of experience, and also in having the collective hundreds of years of experience of the community in my brain, or having access to them if I need to ask them a question. So when somebody asks me, should I do X? I start laughing and I say, probably. You might learn something useful. Okay, now that I've got past the nonsense answer, the real answer is, I don't know. Tell me a little more about your situation. Or, I'm going to make some guesses about your situation. And if this is true, you should do X. And if this is true, maybe now's not the right time to do X. None of these XP practices are no-brainers. There isn't a single XP practice that I could say everyone should always do these things. But the meta practice of imagining what it's like to practice those practices is probably always a good idea. What would it be like if we tried to do pair programming? What would it be like if we tried to do test-driven development? What would it be like if we tried to change our plan every week? You know, Ron Jeffries used to say that if you lock a team in a room for 2 weeks and tell them that the only rule is they have to ship something, they'll discover extreme programming or something very much like it. I think that's true. And so you could either go the Kanban or Scrum route of locking yourself in a room and forcing yourself to discover everything, or you can read what other people have discovered and imagine what it would be like to do those things and make some educated guesses about whether that would help you in your situation, and then use something like theory of constraints as a way to guide you into deciding where to start.
Okay. One last question about extreme programming that's more like a personal curiosity. Have you ever seen a system metaphor?
Yes and no. So every time that I've talked about system metaphors, the ones that I've seen worked have been metaphors where the metaphor was something else from computers. So, for example, I've been spending time working with Spotify over the last several years in Stockholm, and one of the groups that I worked with there was doing some software related to manipulating audio and video files. And they were doing it in Java. It wasn't my decision. Not that it's a good or a bad decision. I'm just emphasizing that that's not what I was there for. But it became, as we started trying to refactor the code a little bit and try to isolate the core business logic from, or domain logic from the, like you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of infrastructure integration there because they're running FFmpeg from inside Java, so they're getting to know the process management API in Java. And what became obvious to me after a few weeks of trying to just write tests and isolate the domain logic from the technology integration was that what was emerging was a little bit of the Unix style standard in, standard out pipeline mechanism. And that what was emerging from the code, what was trying to emerge in the code was this kind of mechanism of having a very high level abstraction about how these various parts, these various modules would share data with each other. And that thinking of it in terms of composing Unix tools with the pipeline operator was an obvious way to go. And once we started to think of it that way, then certain design decisions became easier to arrive at without having to just naively start building it and then refactor our way there. It's a little bit like once you see a design pattern in your code emerging, you can probably safely refactor more quickly in that direction, and that's probably an okay decision. It's occasionally wrong. That could be one of those mountains where it happens to be, it looks high, but it isn't as high as you think. But most of the time, it tends to work out well. So the metaphor that worked there was think of the various modules in this system as Unix tools, which made us think about having very strict rules about how they depended on each other, having strong abstractions at the integration points, and therefore kept the modules very much easier to change independently of each other. Now, an experienced programmer might look at that and say, well, duh. So you did insert design principle X here. Yes, I suppose anybody who has significant experience thinking about modular systems, thinking about what we think of as strong architecture, would just see that directly for what it is and wouldn't think of that as a system metaphor. But for people who are not accustomed to thinking that way, but who know enough Unix to have used Bash and pasted a bunch of, have done unique then sort, that's a powerful metaphor for them because they don't have to rediscover all the modularity principles from first principles that they would learn if they refactored. They could think more in, okay, well, I have my intuition tells me this should be a module and the connection should be through a pipe. How do we make that happen? And if they see it right away, they can write it that way. And if they don't see it right away, then they can remove duplication and see how they're refactoring in that direction. So most of the system metaphors that I've seen have been like that. There has been some other concept in computer technology that has made it easier for them to think about how to organize the code. Occasionally, I will use accounting and double entry bookkeeping as a metaphor. But again, some people think of that as a highly technical metaphor. So when I explain that to people, some of them will say, yeah, but that's not what we really mean by system metaphor. They're expecting something more, I don't know what they're expecting. It reminds me a little bit of in the early days of object-oriented programming, when people were preaching about reuse as a benefit. They had this weird idea in their head that everybody would use the same customer class, everybody would use the same account class, everybody would use the same order class. And that was never going to work, right? It took us about 20 years to finally admit that that was never going to work. But what does become reusable is the technology integration stuff. That's the part that becomes reusable from system to system. So that you can, all your craft work happens in modeling your domain, but then when it comes time to attach that to databases and file systems and networks, that you don't write any of that. That it would be insane for you to write any of that. That what you have are these powerful abstractions which are standard, and databases, files, networks are just adapters that fit into those abstractions. The same way that, the wall socket is an abstraction that you can plug anything in the world into that socket as long as it has the right adapter. And if everybody would just standardize on the EU adapter there, then life would be a lot simpler worldwide. But that's okay. So to me, it feels very much like that. I think people have in their mind that there's going to be some metaphor from a different domain that's going to help them understand this domain better. And I just don't think domains are related to each other strongly enough in that way. But having one metaphor, having one sort of system of thought for how to think about piecing technology bits together might make it easier for you to do that same thing in a different environment. So that if you're programming in Ruby, you can take some lessons from Unix, and that affects the way you design the dependency between your Ruby objects. That's the kind of metaphor that I have found helpful. And something like double entry bookkeeping is so simple and so universal that it's a powerful metaphor, specifically because it's universal and simple. Debits equal credits. And if debits don't equal credits, you made a mistake somewhere. Which is an excellent metaphor for test first programming. Or what was one of the other classics there? It's not coming to me. Maybe I'll remember it as soon as we stop talking.
Okay. You mentioned the theory of constraints a number of times, and I know you see it as a kind of foundational idea that influences a lot of the advice that you give and a lot of the things. We don't have time to go into all the theory of constraints, but maybe a few pointers for people who have heard it now for the first time about it and would be interested in, finding out more.
Yeah, so certainly the classic remains the book The Goal, Process of Ongoing Improvement by Eliyahu Goldratt. I've never heard the audiobook, but I'm told that the audiobook is extremely well produced. So especially even if you're not the type of person who generally likes audiobooks, you might prefer to consume this one by audiobook instead of reading it. But reading it is still quite good. It is a business novel. If you hate business novels, then that's a shame. And if you the story of the goal happens in the context of a manufacturing plant. And if that feels too alien to you, then the alternative book is called Phoenix Project, which is essentially the goal if it had been written in the 21st century and about a software company. So they're both good places to start. The sort of extremely short version of theory of constraints that might help start making the connection with XP and Agile software development in general is the idea that everything is a system. Every system has a bottleneck, and the bottleneck is the place that slows the system down. So whatever it is that you want to get out of the system, however you measure that, the bottleneck is the part of the system that limits how much you can get out of the system, and every system has a bottleneck no matter what you do. And so one of the approaches in Agile software development is to try to recognize where the bottlenecks are and then to apply practices that change the dynamics of the bottleneck, that either move the bottleneck around or move the bottleneck out of the system. If you read Extreme Programming Installed, the second edition, it's literally in there. Kent writes that the goal of extreme programming is to move the bottleneck out of the software development team. So into marketing, into sales, into hiring, whatever, but essentially to move the bottleneck out of software development. Your goal is to reach the point where they can't, assuming that they are outside the team, they can't come up with ideas fast enough to keep you busy. That's your goal. And if you do that, you've succeeded. That would be a measure of success for extreme programming. So that's where bottleneck theory is useful. And the other part is throughput accounting, which is essentially when you focus on cost, bad things happen. Think about value, and in particular, first think about value, and next think about the flow of value. So if you're familiar with those terms, if you've heard that before, theory of constraints is a way of removing cost as the centerpiece of our management strategies, and instead looking to something else, which is another way of saying valuing effectiveness over efficiency. So theory of constraints, the book Slack, Reinertson's books, all those sort of have a similar message, or I should say the core central message they have in common is as long as you focus on cost, you are creating significant dysfunctions. You need to think about value and maybe even flow of value. Here are some ways to get started. And by the way, it also provides a good way to coach teams, because when you work with a team either as an outsider or an insider, and they have 37 conflicting ideas about how to change the way they work, one way to resolve the conflict is to agree on where the bottleneck is and then focus on that and only do the things that should help with the bottleneck and focus your experimentation there. I mean, that's kind of the centerpiece of how I coach teams. And it helps avoid wasting a lot of energy on what should we do next. And we need to do pair programming. No, we don't. We need to do test-driven development. No, we don't. A lot of that goes away when we all agree that support is our bottleneck. Therefore, we need to do more testing, or responding to changes in the product owner's crazy ideas is the bottleneck. Therefore, we need to deliver smaller features sooner and not make too big a commitment. That makes a lot of these practices, adopting these practices, non-controversial. So the goal, Phoenix Project, those are good places to start. And even just reading the Wikipedia page on theory of constraints is not bad. I would like to add one more thing. I became really interested in theory of constraints when I read Mary and Tom Poppendick's book, the first one. It was Agile Manager's Toolkit. I can't remember the full title of it. It was the one that they wrote, and then I think a year or two later became Implementing Lean Software Development from Concept to Cash. So it was the book that came before that. And that was the first book that said theory of constraints, value stream mapping, these tools are the reason why Agile works. When Agile works, it works because of these things. And that was when I first got the idea of, oh, okay, so now there's a way for me to describe why this works to people that might convince them more. Now, it didn't really convince them more, but I certainly felt a lot more secure about what I was teaching because I could point to some kind of logic behind it, some kind of reason behind it. And then I sort of went down the rabbit hole of theory of constraints a little bit and learned enough to be dangerous and enough to, help people. And that's, that was about 2005, 2006. And since then, it makes it a lot easier to introduce people to the ideas of extreme programming without using the words extreme programming in case that's helpful. Because if I can talk to them about some ideas from theory of constraints, even without saying theory of constraints, if I can teach them about throughput accounting, teach them about bottleneck theory, and if I see signs that they are intuitively agreeing with it, then when I say mob programming, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, sounds like an obvious thing to try. Let's give that a shot. It makes life a lot easier.
Yeah, that's true. I've seen that in practice as well. We are getting close to the end, but before we go there, I know you've been using for a number of years getting things done. And once again, it's a big topic. We don't want to go into it too much. What I'd like to get out of you is, why do you find this useful for time management? And why would, for example, a programmer or a manager who is watching this be interested in looking more into GTD?
So I guess the short version is that, kind of the same way that XP is not about going faster but finishing sooner, GTD is about not going faster but instead finishing sooner. So there are a couple of key things that I think that the central thing that viewers might care about is that GTD provides a really good system for dealing with open loops. So you've experienced an open loop when you've sent someone an email and 3 days later, you have this funny feeling in your head that says, oh, I don't think I got a reply to that email yet. I should go follow up with them. That's an open loop. So when there's something that you're working on where you either get stuck or you have to wait for somebody and you need a good system for not letting that sit for too long. Or because, of course, the worst thing usually in those situations are when that falls through the cracks. So you send somebody an email asking a question, you forget about it. 8 days later, you get an angry phone call, an angry email, an angry text. Your manager comes into your office and says, where the hell is this? And the first thing you think of is, oh, right, I asked a question about that 8 days ago and I never got a response back. That's the danger of an open loop. And so GTD provides some nice mechanisms for managing those open loops. Again, GTD is not the only way to do it. You don't need GTD to do it. It just happens to be a very good way to do it. And managing open loops is one small part. It's sort of learning to manage open loops is one of the etudes of getting things done. So that might be enough to hook you to get started. Another is just programmers out there know the experience of being distracted by trying to remember too many things and not being able to focus on what they're doing. They're remembering things that are involved in the code they're writing. They're remembering the things they need to do next, like in the next hour or two. Like, where do I go next after I finish this part? They remember a meeting. They have in their mind a meeting they have to attend the next day that they have to prepare for. They have in their mind that they have to do some grocery shopping on their way home from the office, for those of you who are still working in the office right now. These are all distractions that weigh heavily. And most programmers underestimate the weight of those distractions. And so getting things done includes things like the inbox technique, which really helps in that minute-to-minute experience of getting the distractions out of your head so that you can focus on the current task. And focusing on the current task means that you make fewer mistakes. You might not go faster, but you finish sooner. There's less to do. You feel more confident that it's done when you think it's done. And maybe the single greatest experience early on for somebody who practices this is when you're writing things down in your inbox as they pop into your head. You get them out of your head, focus on the current task, and then you say, great, I'm done this task. So then you look at your inbox and you notice something on the list. And the first reaction is, oh, forgot to do that. Oh no. And then you realize, oh, somebody reminded me to do that. Because a worse experience is forgetting to do it and then getting a tester to give you a bug 3 weeks later. A better experience is to look over that and say, I wrote it down. I didn't have to think about it for an hour and a half. I noticed it before it was too late. I can spend 10 extra minutes and do it now. That was one of the things that happened to me early that really hooked me into the idea of using these techniques. So that can be enough to get started. And then gradually you'll learn things like managing time is stage 0. Managing energy matters a hell of a lot more. There's a wonderful book called The Power of Full Engagement that talks about this in detail. And that even managing your energy isn't just about managing open loops and writing things down to get them out of your head. Those are all ingredients. But what really matters over the longer term is being honest about what capacity you have to do work, managing your workload to match your capacity instead of overcommitting and under-delivering. Again, call back to XP. Planning XP was about planning to capacity, not about whining that the team doesn't seem to be able to do what you want them to do, but adjusting your plan to fit what the team can do. So this is doing the same thing at the individual level. And then it becomes much easier to ask deeper, more important, more significant questions, more impactful questions like, should I be trying to do this at all? Is this a part of my area of responsibility? Should I delegate this to somebody else? Is this part of my life mission? Is this part of my work mission? Should I really be sacrificing time with my family to do this? Should I really be sacrificing time recovering to do this? That's the long-term benefits of getting things done. I think that's the part that, if you've heard about getting things done and you have this picture in your head that it's just a time management technique, the time management part is just getting your act together at the simplest level, is to stop wasting so much time. And then you get into the really good stuff. Should I be doing this stuff at all? Is this part of my responsibility? Is this going to advance my life in any way? Is this going to advance my career in any way? And what do I want out of my career anyway? And again, that's where the, again, having practiced this for 15 years, I now feel like I'm in a position to be able to help people have those conversations, give them little nuggets of GTD to help frame that discussion, to help them explore those ideas, and then say to them, oh, and by the way, if you're feeling overwhelmed by the tasks that you're working on, if you feel like things are slipping through the cracks, if you feel like these open loops are causing too much stress, here's a 4-page guide to help you get started at fixing that problem. And then when you've recovered enough energy that you can spend 3 hours on a weekend, here's the book. And the funny thing is that I'm actually using theory of constraints to help people learn getting things done. And it seems to be pretty effective so far.
Well, Joe, this has been extremely interesting and very useful. Before we close, do you want to say anything in the end to people who are watching? Where can they find you, or perhaps other things?
Yeah, so the easiest thing is just, I don't know if my shirt is in the shot, but the easiest thing is to just remember JBrains. That's been my username since my IBM days. So if you look for me, if you search for JBrains, there's a good chance you'll find me. And yes, I do pronounce it that way. That wasn't my fault. Somebody pronounced it that way, and I said, oh, that's cute. I'm going to start calling myself that. So you can go to jbrains.ca, and that's sort of an entry point to me. You can find me on Twitter. You can find jbrains.ca on Facebook. You can find me, Rainsberger, on LinkedIn. You can just go to ask.jbrains.ca and ask me a question. I will answer them all, but when I get around to it. As I tell everyone, as long as you're willing to wait indefinitely for the answer, that service is free. And then if you want a better service level agreement, then we talk about how much that costs. And I offer, coaching by email at a pretty low price. That's a monthly subscription. You can hire me for remote working sessions. It's especially useful now, and that can be anything from personal coaching to pair programming and doing TDD together. You can read my programming type articles at blog.thecodewhisperer.com. It was the year 2000 when I chose the name, so don't blame me for the fact that it's an old-fashioned reference. And you can go to blog.jbrains.ca to read about less technical, more general purposey kind of stuff, still in a software context. I hang out occasionally on Quora and answer questions there. And I do really encourage you, if you're interested in diving more into extreme programming, test-driven development, and you want to have access not just to me, but to the wider community, it's very fragmented now. You could sign up for 137 different Slack groups, or you could go to groups.io and search for test-driven development or extreme programming, all shoved together as one word. And there's literally 20 years of archive there. You can read a bunch of old stuff, and you can start a conversation with any of a number of experienced extreme programming, Scrum, Agile, Kanban practitioners who are happy to answer your questions. And as long as that's working for you, then you don't have to pay a thing.
That's great, JB. This has been, again, very interesting. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and especially during these times. It's very, very fun to focus on other things than pandemics and
Yes.
figuring out.
And I have to say, I've had so much fun in having to have this conversation, because I'm not going to have a chance to come to Bucharest this year. I don't get to go there every year, but it's nice to know that we have that we can have a lot of the feeling of sitting across from the table at a nice Greek restaurant. The only difference is that we don't have the food in front of us right now.
Yeah, maybe we can solve that. I was thinking about having a virtual code and beer thing, so perhaps we can do something like that.
We have plenty of bottles of wine in the basement, so I'd be happy to do that.
That's really cool. So thank you all. Don't forget to look to our channel for the other interviews that we had. It's a long list now of conversations. I like long form content, and that's why we are producing this kind of long form content, because we can discuss more relaxed about various things and figure out how XP was developed and how we got where we are today. Did you want to
if long form content is okay, then look on YouTube for one of my talks called Surviving Your Inevitable Agile Transition, which is about 90 minutes long, and it goes into a little bit more detail about how you actually, if your manager taps you on the shoulder and warns you that you're going Agile on Monday, how do you make that work for you? Because I as you noticed, I like to talk, so long form content is one of my specialties too.
Yeah, perfect. Subscribe to the channel. Share with your friends if you find this interesting, or with your colleagues, or with your managers. Maybe they would like to learn more about theory of constraints or about GTD. I've seen many managers who could use GTD. And until next time, remember to think design and work smart. See ya.